Oh, there you are. Decided finally to ride in on your high horse? Well, speaking of high horses, there are many taboos common to the fair folk. 1. That you must never call them names. 2. That you are never to desecrate one of their sacred circles. And 3. That you must never, ever eat or drink any of their food. For if you do, you will never return to the land you call home. You will be trapped in their lands for eternity. On a surprisingly warm, muggy Nottinghamshire day in the sun, Davey Griffith had decided to take a day off from the office for a nice long walk. An irritating young Canadian man named Calvin had found his email address and had been sending him long, oblivious missives full of stream-of-consciousness questions. Davey replied to each and every one, demanding that he stop. Then, when he was almost to the point of begging, they suddenly stopped coming in. Davey wasn't expecting to miss the long, annoying questionnaires, but he did. He grew lonely and bored without them. He struggled with his feelings for a long time before he decided he needed to clear himself of this silliness. It was time to take advantage of that nice, thick weather. So off he went. He brought a freshly shined apple, his notebook to draw shrubs and leaves in, and his finest knee-high boots, in case the insects felt extra nippy. As a vetted Scorpio, Davy was seldom chipper unless he was allowed to be an asshole. But this bright, summer sunshine made him feel curiously alive. Or maybe it was the ancient-looking man he'd passed. He had asked him for succor. "Go earn some bread, old man," he called him. "You're being a mendicant. Be a mendicant." He felt very clever about that. The ancient-looking man had responded with a bizarre dance and then shuffled away. Whatever the source of his high spirits, Davy wandered further and further away from his suburban home office, out of his English garden towards the woods, and then on through them for hours, swinging his arms back and forth without a care in the world. Deep in the wood, a clearing opened up before him. It was almost as though the trees had stepped aside for a small ranch to grow out of the ground at their feet. As he made his way closer, Davy could hear soft whinnying sounds from the stables on the far side of the barn. With each step, the sounds got louder, until the smell of hay and animal musk filled his senses. What were horses doing out in the middle of the woods? Davy's curiosity and his innate compulsion to solve mysteries got the better of him. He resolved to find out who was in charge and why they were here. Horses trotted skittishly to and fro as Davy approached the door. He rapped his knuckles against the door. No sounds responded from inside. He waited. He knocked again. Nothing. Davy was not a man to give up or walk away quietly. Davy was a man to become increasingly obnoxious until that which opposed him lost resolve and gave in to his whims. It took 2 hours of pounding on the door for him to realize that he was not going to be answered. By then, his poor English wrists were quite tired, and his sad little knuckles raw. He finally decided to try the knob, which of course did not turn because the house was locked. He considered throwing something through the window, but then realized how poorly that might be received by the local authorities. The horses looked at him with a renewed ennui as he finally descended the steps and walked away from the house. Not far off, Davy found a big tree to sit down under to rest his poor, tired little wrist, his weary knuckles, and, as it would happen, the rest of his worn-out self. Looking up, he noticed something very interesting. He pulled out his notepad and pencil from his sack, setting himself down to draw the strangest fruit he'd ever seen. The boughs of his shade were heavy laden with them. They looked like tiny helmets. A sagging branch within reach showed a very ripe-looking helmet. Davy reached up and picked it. It was hard like a helmet, shiny like a helmet. It was covered in sponsorship stickers, like a helmet. He bit it. A piece of tooth chipped away, leaving only a very small scratch in the fruit. It tasted like a helmet, too. He began his field notes on the hard new fruit, complete with sketches. He intended to research what it could possibly be later. As he took notes, the world slowly became blurry and dark. Davy didn't notice himself nodding off, overcome with fatigue under a strange tree. He also didn't seem to notice that he was surrounded by tiny pairs of white pants. There was a ring of them, hidden in the grass around the tree. Davy passed out. He came to, in the process of being carried into the ranch by 8 tiny men creatures. Before he even knew what was happening, they'd set him down in their living room, which was full of undersized furniture. It was styled like a lodge. The walls were wood-paneled. There was a tiny little stone fireplace, and tiny little sports magazines on the tiny little side tables at either end of the couch. He snapped back to his senses, alarmed by this kidnapping. "You fell asleep under a jockey tree, bloke. You're in our world now," said one of them, generously trying to help him make quick sense of his new reality. "What is this?" Davy demanded. "What are you little things?" The lot of them gawked in offense for a second. Then, almost in unison, they shook it off. It couldn't have been anything but an unintentional slight, a byproduct of his surprise, surely. The miniature man cleared his throat and replied, "We're jockeys, large sir." Davy took a moment to drink in this information. He surveyed the room, the ceiling only slightly higher than his own 5 feet 10 inches. A tiny guitar rested beside the tiny stone fireplace, the smell of hot cross buns fresh from an oven in the next room. Yet another tiny man popped his head through the kitchen doorway. "You hungry, dear?" he asked in a gruff voice, yet high-pitched. "We got pie, buns, apple crumble, and scones." Davy felt his stomach. It was wobbly. He was hungry. He nodded in reply. "The lot, then!" The gruff one nodded in return, ducking back into the kitchen. The rest of the jockeys ushered Davy toward the center of the room. On his way, he grabbed the guitar. The jockey to whom it belonged tried to object, but was unheard as everybody settled in. The rest of them found their seats on the couches, and soon food was delivered on a fresh platter for everyone. Butter, jams, and marmalades of every kind decorated the center of the tray. One of the jockeys waved his arms welcomingly over the food. "Tuck in, mate," he said to Davy. But Davy was distracted, tuning the delightfully small instrument. The guitar's owner squeaked with anxiety. "God, you're all so small! I could pick you up like children!" Davy stood up suddenly. The guitar fell from his lap with a resonant bonk. He reached over and lifted the nearest jockey. The man made a sound in protest, but it was muted by Davy's sheer audacity. They were all a little dumbstruck. "In fact, I could hold 2 of you." He grabbed another jockey by the leg, wrenching him from his seat into the air. He held the man aloft, upside down. "Put me down!" he squeaked outraged. "Put me down this instant and eat some nice food." "Why aren't any of you eating?" Davy looked around and noticed that nobody was touching the freshly baked tray of goods. Someone piped up, "We're dieting, sir. We have to avoid carbs. For the work, see?" Still confused, Davy released the 2 jockeys, who hit the hardwood floor with a thud. He sat down again and grabbed the guitar back up off the ground. As if suddenly he forgot about his audience of kidnappers, he refocused on tuning the guitar. The high E string snapped, whipping a jockey to his right. He kept tightening the rest of the strings until the pegboard started pulling away from the body. The guitar's owner finally cried out, "It's too sharp now! It hurts! It hurts!" He held his ears. The jockey, who'd just been whipped, glared daggers at him. Davy, of course, wasn't listening. He continued tuning. When finally he was satisfied with the tuning, which was now both off and ridiculously sharp, he began what he believed was singing. At the top of his lungs, he strummed and sang. Not being entirely oblivious, Davy noticed the jockeys whinging around him. He stopped and cleared his throat. Oh, bother. This small instrument is too broken to play. You shouldn't hang on to trash like this. He looked at it for one last moment, then tossed it away with a flick of his refreshed wrist. It crashed through the window. In the stunned silence, one jockey turned to the ringleader. "Remind me again why we need to trap this bloke." The alpha jockey responded in a hoarse, uncertain whisper. It's just what we do. It's tradition. Humans fall asleep under one of our trees, we trick them into eating our food, and then they're trapped here forever, and we laugh about it. Bloody stupid tradition, if you ask me, muttered the first angrily. Davy shook his head, having ignored the brief exchange the jockeys had just had behind him. Then he remembered his hunger. The food smelled so good. He turned towards the platter of fresh aromatic breads and butters. A swarm of jockeys beat him to it, grabbing all the baked goods and shoving them into their tiny faces as fast as they possibly could. Only crumbs and smears of jellied fruit remained. "Well, that's just bloody nice," Davy spat. "You little bastard said this was for me, and now there's nothing. And weren't you avoiding cobs just a moment ago?" The jockey who said so looked up at him scornfully. "Sorry, sir. We all just remembered we have a big race today. Need all the energy after all. Cheerio." Just then, the kitchen jockey burst in, having been watching and listening from behind the door. He was brandishing a shiny apple. "Here you go, sir. Your own shiny apple. I found it nearby. Eat if you're hungry, sir." Davy snatched the apple out of the jockey's hand, biting it ragefully. He looked around the room. The men all looked on with fear. Davy's eyes gleamed with revenge for the rescinded hospitality. He looked at the butter, jams, and marmalades on the table. Before anyone could stop him, he grabbed the butter. He smeared his apple with it, then the jam, pouring globs of it onto the fruit, then the marmalade. He kicked the platter over, spilling crumbs all over the shag carpeting. Davy took a huge bite of his decorated apple and swallowed it, sneering at his friendly captors. "Bloody hell!" screeched the leader of the jockeys. "You're stuck here forever now, you toss-off!" There are many taboos common to the fair folk. 1. That you must never call them names. 2. That you are never to desecrate one of their sacred circles. And 3. That you must never, ever, ever eat or drink any of their food. For if you do, you will never return to the land you call home. You will be trapped in their lands for eternity. But there is talk they may start making exceptions for that last rule. The end.